Hello everyone! Thank you so much for coming here tonight to celebrate author Elizabeth Emerson and her new book, Letters from Red Farm. My name is Morella and I'm the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and purchasing a copy of Elizabeth's book from us, which helps Flyleaf as we return to holding events in the store. To make our events more accessible, we are recording tonight's event and it will be up on our YouTube channel soon. And finally, we are asking authors to conclude before 7 so we can be mindful of our colleagues who are closing up the store after the event. And finally, I'd like to introduce tonight's author. Elizabeth Emerson is a former grant writer and award-winning artist based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She has contributed material to PBS film biography, Becoming Helen Keller, and written guest articles for the American Foundation for the Blind, Helen Keller Collection, and the Perkins Archives newsletter. Please give it up for Elizabeth tonight. And to start us off, Carol has a few words.
Hi, welcome. I'll try not to pop the mic. I had to be kind of loud. Can you all hear? Okay, great. I just wanted to say a little bit about why it's the two of us sitting here. Betsy joined a creative nonfiction memoir workshop in 2012, we figured out. She was working on a memoir about the daughter that she birthed in Ireland, and which I hope will be the next book. It was rather horrific tale. But as she was doing that, as she was working on that, she also began finding out more about her great-great-grandfather and his relationship to Helen Keller. And she came in and said, I'm just finding this so fascinating, and I know this is a memoir workshop, and I'm just wondering if I can transfer my energy to working on the book about my great-great-grandfather and Helen Keller. And she read us some letters and correspondence, and we were like, absolutely, yes. So we were all really fascinated and have been ever since. And so here we are. Now she's finished the book, and it's fabulous. So, Betsy.
Thank you. So I'm going to stand here, and because I have a few notes, I'm going to try not to bore you. I'm not a college professor. I'm not a professional speaker. I'm just the little author who went from working at her desk to standing here. And I really am in disbelief that I'm standing here. And, if somebody had told me 12 years ago that I would have thought they were crazy. And I have thought they were even crazier if they told me that people would be wearing masks as I talk to them. But here we are, and it's amazing to be here, and I thank you all for coming. Many of you had a hand in making this happen in one way or another, if only just encouraging me to keep going and being excited about the story. So I really appreciate you being here.
So Betsy, tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay, I will. So most of you know, but I'll say it anyways, in case you don't. Letters from Red Farm tells the story of the 40-year friendship between Helen Keller and my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, who was called Ed by his family and friends. And they met in Boston when Helen was 8 years old and Ed was almost 40. And I have two pictures, Carol.
Oh, yep.
That we can pass around that sort of give you an idea of the age difference between them. Helen was a little girl, and
Helen was a girl, and it was a child bride,
and Ed was almost 40 years old, and she had just come to Boston to attend the Perkins School for the Blind. Her teacher, Annie Sullivan, most people know that story, had also attended the Perkins School for the Blind, and so it was really a return to Annie Sullivan's alma mater when they arrived. And Helen had been born in Tuscumbia, Alabama, She was a very healthy and precocious little girl until the age of 19 months, when she developed a high fever that lasted for 2 weeks, and it left her deaf and blind. The story of how Annie Sullivan came to work with Helen, most people know, in the what they call the miracle at the water pump or at the well, when Helen finally understood that her teacher was trying to spell words into her hand that described what was going on in the world around her, and that these motions that Annie was making into her hand were her attempt to communicate with Helen. And there have been books, plays, movies, you name it, about that moment. And so when Helen met Ed Sullivan, she was already an international celebrity at 8 years of age, if you can believe it. But she really was sort of the face, the poster child for the Perkins School already before she even got to Boston. And the newspapers in the Boston area and beyond just hounded Helen and Annie Sullivan. And so it really made the friendship between Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan and Ed Chamberlain really all the more remarkable, because he was a newspaper man. But as a respite from the attention and from her schoolwork, Helen and Annie began spending weekends and holidays at the Chamberlains' home in Wrentham, Massachusetts, outside of Boston.
So tell us a little bit about your relationship to the story and how you discovered it.
So I will do that. So I will read a little bit from the preface of the book. If you've read the book already, I've tried to just condense this, but I sort of thought about how I would respond to that question, and I decided, I'll just sort of fumble along and try to explain things, but the best way to explain it is really to read a bit from the preface, so bear with me a little bit. So as it turns out, our family's best memory keeper was a deaf-blind girl named Helen Keller. I grew up fascinated by books about Helen Keller. It was one of the first biographies or chapter books, as we used to call them when we were kids, one of the first biographies that I read. I was captivated by the story of the wild child who could neither see nor hear, and whose inner potential and delightful personality were revealed by her teacher, Annie Sullivan. While millions around the world also read those stories, I had a unique and personal relationship to them. Books about Helen frequently mentioned times she spent with a family named Chamberlain at their home called Red Farm in Wrentham, a suburb of Boston. As I read, I knew that she spent those happy hours with my great-great-grandparents, Joseph Edgar and his Chamberlain and his wife Ida and their children. Ed and Ida's fourth child and second daughter was Elizabeth, my great-grandmother. The fact that Helen spent parts of her childhood with my ancestors was the extent of my knowledge of the relationship until a few years ago, when I came across copies of 2 letters that had been passed down to me through 4 generations of my family. One was the Letter of Sympathy Helen wrote in 1935 on hearing that her Uncle Ed had passed away. This is a copy of the letter. You can see that it's typed, and then on the second page is her signature, which is extremely recognizable. The other letter Helen had written to Ed a year earlier, a long and an intimate document that illustrated a lengthy history and close relationship of more than 40 years. It was clear that not only were they friends, but the bond between them was deep and lifelong. And like many friendships, theirs appeared to have weathered good times and tumultuous times. I felt compelled to find out more. My research started in earnest in January 2012 when I called the American Foundation for the Blind in New York City, where most of Helen's personal letters and papers are archived. From an online search, I knew there existed a box of letters related to the Chamberlains in their collection. I reached Helen Selsden, the head archivist at the foundation. I began by telling her that I was the great-great-granddaughter of Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, a man who had been a journalist in the Boston area and friends with Helen Keller for many years, and I was interested in doing some research. I could hear the phone being jostled, repositioned. Say that again? I repeated my story, not knowing if I had any business at all making this call. I repeated the story. "Oh my goodness," Miss Salsden said. "The Chamberlains were huge in Helen's life. It's so amazing to hear from you. Are you really of the family?" She was eager to help me. 5 days later, I received a 20-page list of hits in the Foundation database that involved the Chamberlains. And when I say a 20-page list, I mean bulleted, one after another, just documenting multiple letters and with a short summary of each letter. So I could see that, okay, that was a letter that she wrote on such and such a day, and it was about this. So, it was just amazing. It was a thick pack of pages. It was immediately obvious from the entries that the narrative revealed would not be the one I had expected. Somehow I had imagined I would discover a pleasant, straightforward tale about my friendly family who invited Helen and Annie for dinners and holidays at their home. Instead, what I found was a complex and multi-layered story that told of joys and talents, but also of controversy, tragedy, and personal and systemic failings. 6 months after my first call, I visited the AFB offices in New York City. The Helen Keller archive file room was filled floor to ceiling with neatly labeled boxes of letters and photographs, movie reels and monographs related to Helen and Annie Sullivan. Miss Salsden had already identified key boxes where she thought I should begin my research. She loaded my arms, then her own, with folders and showed me to a cubicle. The hundreds of letters were organized by author and in chronological order. The earliest was a March 1892 letter from Ed to Annie asking if Helen was giving thought to an earlier request from him to write a little written account of her instruction for the popular periodical he edited called The Youth's Companion, which I have a copy of here just to show you what a magazine looked like in 1895, which this issue is. And you can see it's extremely dense, and this was entertainment back then. You waited for your copy of The Youth's Companion, and had advertisements on the back. And he was an editor and writer for Youth's Companion, which was a national magazine. I was thrilled to see for the first time the small flowing handwriting of my great-great-grandfather. It was clear that Helen and her teacher were already acquainted with him, for he wrote, "You know me, I do not want a long story." Those files provided the perfect starting point, but I would subsequently find countless other sources. The AFB documents led me to the Alexander Graham Bell family papers archived at the Library of Congress, which provided copies of many more letters and even more illuminating details. As a journalist for more than 60 years, Ed Chamberlain left a long and rich trail of his own. A number of biographies of the avant-garde artists and writers who frequented Red Farm mentioned the Chamberlain family and aspects of their life. The Perkins School archive, with its carefully kept scrapbooks of over 100 years of newspaper clippings, was also invaluable. But the writer who gave the most consistent breadth and detail of life in the Chamberlain household was Helen herself. She was a prolific and generous letter writer, and in reading her vivid descriptions, it is easy to forget that she was deafblind. Words were everything to her. When spelled into her hand by her companions, they were her window to what was happening around her. And when spelled or written by her to others, they were her primary means for telling what she was thinking and feeling. In Ed Chamberlain, a man she met when she was just 8 years old, who lived in the service of words and cared deeply about people and social issues in the natural world, Helen found a most sympathetic and understanding friend, mentor, and advocate. This is their story.
So tell us a little bit about Red Farm. Who came there? What the draw of Red Farm, and a little bit more about Ed's involvement in the culture of the times.
Okay. at various, there have been various iterations of the book, but one of the things that my editor at University of Massachusetts Press asked for was an early and clear description of Red Farm. So I was sort of indignant, in the editing process. You thought you'd done all this, but I went out for a long walk and I came back and I knew exactly what I needed to do. Walking is my creative tool, I would say. So this is what I wrote, and I sent it to him immediately, and he said, that's exactly what I wanted. So, and there's a picture Carol has of Red Farm, so you can sort of have that visual as I read. At some point in time, the place became known as Red Farm. It was an idyllic spot, just a short train ride out from Boston, in the village of Wrentham, Massachusetts. In the late 1800s, it was a working farm situated on 30 or so acres of open fields that straddled the crest of a hill and overlooked a small lake called King Philip's Pond. The property featured a large, red-painted farmhouse with a wide front porch that commanded a view of the lake below. Multiple red barns and outbuildings peppered the property, and a tall windmill on scaffolding dominated the front yard. To the rear, a deep, vine-covered ravine dropped away from the house and main barn. Several large trees close to the house provided shade in summer months. For those at Red Farm, it was little trouble to shift from farming pursuits to boating and swimming in summer, or ice skating and sledding in winter, simply by crossing the dirt lane in front of the house and strolling down the embankment to the lake. It was a perfect combination of waterfront resort and rural farm life. Red Farm cast a spell over its residents and guests. Over many years, it was the gathering place for a lively and diverse crowd of intellectuals and creative minds drawn to the location and the hospitality of Boston journalist Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, his wife Ida, and their children. Poets and writers, artists and musicians, naturalists, theologians, social reformers, and celebrities all flocked to Red Farm, captivated by its brilliant and stimulating atmosphere. Guests were invited to help with farm chores and meals if so inclined, before gathering in the evening for readings and performances by young and old alike, indoors in front of a large stone fireplace in cold weather or outside on the lawn in summer. Chamberlain himself presided over these assemblies, gently encouraging and mentoring aspiring writers or reading his own works. This was the atmosphere into which Helen and Annie were welcomed and embraced.
So Betsy, for people who feel they know everything or they know a whole lot about Helen Keller, what did you find in your research, or how can you elaborate on her personality from what you gleaned in your research?
So should I back up a little and say a little more about Ed?
Yes.
Or no?
Well, I mean, I absolutely fell in love with Ed. You will all fall in love with Ed if you haven't read about Ed. Yeah. Tell a little
Just
more
a little
about
bit. So he was born in Vermont, and to a family that had founded the town of Newbury, Vermont. And when he was 6 years, well, first of all, he was the youngest of 10 children. His oldest sister was 24 years old when he was born, which I always think is such a statement about women's lives at the time. Can you imagine just, having a 24-year-old daughter, and she was already married when you had this last child. And so when he was 6 years old, the family moved to Wisconsin. And it's important that you know this, that they were almost certainly agents on the Underground Railroad, and that is probably why they moved to Wisconsin. They were Congregationalists, they were vocal abolitionists, they housed itinerant speakers at their home, just very public about their anti-slavery stance. So they moved to Wisconsin. Ed was educated in a one-room schoolhouse. he grew up in this atmosphere of people with conviction, and he was the youngest, and so spent a lot of time listening to the adults in his household. At the age of 17, after graduating from the one-room schoolhouse, he went to Chicago, and his older brother was already an established writer for the Chicago Evening Post, so Ed got a job holding copy, which was at the end of the night when all the reporters' writing came in. He would, and they had to type whatever they did, set type. He had to hold the copy for the proofreader, and he thought this was just amazing for a young boy. That was what he wanted to be doing. But an event happened that launched his career and made his name a household name, and that was the Great Chicago Fire. He was one of the first. He had by that time become, been allowed to go out on to report, file stories, and he was one of the first eyewitnesses on the scene of the Great Chicago Fire. And his accounts are still, if you Google the Great Fire and look for eyewitness accounts, his name comes up. But I imagine that it was also very traumatic for him. What he witnessed over those days, I think, just really scarred him for life. But that's just my impression. So over the next 10 years, he was distraught, really, that he was not allowed to go to college. He wanted to go to college, but his family couldn't provide that for him. So he self-educated himself at the Chicago Public Library. And as he said, he set a course of study for himself and read the classics. He read everything that he could get his hands on. And he also married the lovely Ida Atwood in 1873, and they started their own family. So he quickly climbed the ranks of Chicago newspapers. It was a very, very competitive world, and he became a managing editor by the time he was in his late 20s. But he suffered what was called a nervous breakdown, and left Chicago and returned to the East in 1880, eventually settling in Boston. But he never again took on managerial roles for newspapers. I think he discovered that was not, that wasn't what he was cut out to do. He was a writer and an editor. So I think what you asked, what's unique about the book, and I think that there's so much is written about Helen Keller. You can, the PBS documentary a few weeks ago, she still fascinates people. But this book presents a much more intimate view of Helen. It's Helen in the context of a friendship. And so much of the book is really her words and Ed's words. And so I think it's just a really different look at her life and at her as a person. She adored Ed Chamberlain. She called him Uncle Ed, and she credited him with what she called her education in literary ways. She also wanted his influence on her life to be known, but he was modest and remained quietly in the background. He actually wrote, he had a byline called The Listener of the Boston Transcript, so he didn't even always identify himself as Joseph Edgar Chamberlain or J.E. Chamberlain. He was the listener of the Boston Transcript, and I think that reflects how he wanted to go through life. He just wanted to be the man in the back of the room and, telling what his observations were. But she wrote many articles about him, and he wrote many articles about her. In one letter she wrote to a friend in 1898, which would have been when she was 18, she said, "I wish you knew Mr. Chamberlain better. I think you would find much to admire in his character. He runs through life's maze of joys and woes so peacefully and with such kindliness towards all living things that one cannot be with him and not feel something of his gentle influence." And he wrote about her in ways that few people could, since she had lived with the Chamberlains or at least she lived with them for a year, but she also spent many, many holidays and vacations with them. He wrote this for the nationally syndicated Sunday magazine. And again, just to emphasize that their their writings about each other had really a national and international audience. It wasn't just Boston focused. He wrote, and this is one of my favorite bits that he wrote about her. He said, he described what it was like to dine with Helen. He said, "No one comes in a blither mood to the table than Helen Keller. Her little helplessnesses there may trouble her inwardly, but she good-naturedly puts them aside as things not worthy of any show of attention from herself or others, thereby unconsciously rebuking the form of egotism by which we consistently ask the pardon of others for our little awkwardnesses and blunders. She thinks of the table as a place where everyone is having a good time and seeks to join in this good time at once. Of course, the person next to her, who is presumably her teacher or some other friend who communicates with her in the sign language for the deaf made upon her hand, must act as her ears for what is said, and her own words are in her half-chanted, peculiarly uttered speech. Of course, she does not know when others are speaking and depends on the fact being signified to her by her neighbor. She waits with a smile of sweet patience until others are silent. Sometimes, in merry companies, it is a long time before Helen gets the right of way, and when she speaks, what she says is generally well worth listening to, and generally starts the table off on another tack with its suggestion. Yet it is an odd thing that no one's talk is less introspective, less egotistic, less of the talker than Helen Keller's. She is fond of relating a story or repeating a witticism or clever thought that she has read, but I have never heard a person who is as invariably pleased by other people's jokes as Helen Keller. So again, in the book, you have Ed's unique perspective on Helen. And as much as I could in the writing of this book, I really wanted to let their words tell the story. They were both eloquent writers, and so really one of my first challenges was to figure out how to set them off, how not to compete with them, how to let them really shine. The book also, I think, illuminates the many challenges Helen faced in her pursuit of education. It emphasizes the importance of advocacy. Ed was a tireless advocate for Helen, the work of the Perkins School, the students of the Kindergarten for the Blind at Perkins, and other marginalized members of society. And Helen became a tireless advocate as well. The book also really follows Helen's growing interest in social issues. She learned deeply from Ed Chamberlain, and it really demonstrates the influence that he had on her politics, her social activism, and her belief in her own voice and power as an agent for change. So, and not only is this Helen and Ed's story, but it's really a social portrait of the times, demonstrating how life was fraught with challenges, struggles, tragedies, failures, and losses. It's also a time frame, I think, that a lot of people don't know a lot about. The time frame really from pre-Civil War until just before World War II. And it also was the golden age of newspapers. And so the book really provides a fascinating history of the journalism world. But the book, sadly, is also surprisingly contemporary. Many of the barriers Helen faced are struggles that people with disabilities still face every day today, especially the prejudices of able-bodied people who overlook people with disabilities and refuse to create inclusive communities and workplaces. So I'm going to close with a few words from that letter that I held up earlier that Helen wrote on the day after she heard that he had died.
Betsy, can I just interject something? Yeah. One of the things that I found really fascinating about this book was the incredible dramatic tension that we find as we move through Helen's attempts to go to Radcliffe and to continue her education. People try to take Annie Sullivan away from her, and it's just. I mean, it's a really gripping story. You might think, oh, letter, but it's really, it's not that way at all. And Betsy references so many people who had various agendas for Helen and for Annie. And you see how these same things persist today. Britney Spears' dad. I mean, it's not exactly the same situation, but just this. They were just constantly being assaulted and challenged, and I found myself. I mean, I pretty much knew the story of her life, and she lived a long, happy, difficult life. But when you read this, Betsy has chosen just enough from this whole host of characters, including Ed's wife and the whatever his name is. We wouldn't even like to mention his name in person, but anyway, people who were just constantly kind of at her, and trying to mold her, trying to shape her. And I think the book does a really good job of not only showing her affinity with Ed, and their support of each other, but certainly his support of her in cultivating herself, and just it's a really gripping tale. I just want to make sure that comes across.
Yeah, we have to have the spoiler alert. If you've read the book, you can't spoil it for everybody.
Right.
But I'll talk a little bit. I'll lead into that a little bit. So this last letter that Helen wrote, which was really her letter of sympathy, I'm just going to read an excerpt, and hopefully it'll be the teaser that makes you want to read more. So she wrote, this was to Ed's third wife, so not my great-great-grandmother. She had passed away some years before, so this is his third wife. Dear Aunt Jenny, I received with tender sorrow up here in the Catskills the telegram with the news of dear Uncle Ed's death. When I last saw him, so brave and interested in everything, I could not think that he would leave us so soon. If I could take you and the others who loved him in my arms, you would feel the sympathy no words can utter. I realize that there can be no consolation for the loss of one whose life was a part of your own, but affection will speak, the affection my teacher and I have had for Uncle Ed during many years. We remember how he always understood and appreciated us both. The tears come as I think how bound up he is in the fateful experience of our lives. So those fateful experiences are really what Letters from Red Farm captures, and I hope you will read it and learn and enjoy. So,
just beautiful writing. All of these people who wrote letters, especially Helen and Ed, but I don't even know how you managed to. She would read these letters in the workshop, and be a 4-page letter. So how are you ever going to find an excerpt to cull? But she just does a beautiful job of this patchwork of relationships and observations, and lots of people represented, and just really beautiful.
Thank you. So, Carol had mentioned we did a book talk in Vermont.
A Zoom,
virtual event, and you had mentioned that people most often like to hear about the process of writing and the research. So, is that something you want to? Okay. So I guess I should say that I started out with these 2 letters, and then I had all of the Foundation for the Blind material, but over the course of the time that I worked on this book, more and more archives became digitized. So where in 2012, when I started, I had to go to places or I had to request materials. Over time, through a lot of foundation support, various programs, the Perkins School, the Foundation for the Blind, had their archives digitized. So now you can go online and you can say, Joseph Edgar Chamberlain to Helen Keller, and all of these letters will just appear magically. And the same is true for the Library of Congress. More and more material is available online. So I was able to do a lot of research that way. And then, I thought I had exhausted one source, but then, 50 more letters would suddenly be available. So even though I'd gone to that archive, I had to go back. And sometimes, just a different keyword would make a huge difference. And so it was just always new discoveries. And in 2019, I thought I had finished everything, but for some reason I decided one afternoon to just do another search or look for something. And this letter came up from Alexander Graham Bell to his wife. And it just was like the cherry on top of the sundae. And I think to myself, if I hadn't found that, or, it just was a journey like that. It was all these little things, and then all of a sudden it'd be like, wow, that is what I had no idea that existed, but here it is, and I have to work that in. So it was so much fun, and just like I said, just when I thought I was done, I'd find something else. I also had wonderful experiences as far as I wrote some online articles for the Foundation for the Blind and for the Perkins School. And because of that, this Ed story and myself became more discoverable online. So people would reach out to me and say, oh, I read your article, that you wrote for the Foundation for the Blind. And the most amazing one was this couple in Chicago who were working on a book, and they called me or contacted me on Facebook, and then we got together for a phone call. And they were writing a book about a man who was Ed's office mate in New York City. And so they were looking in these archives, these obscure archives in Kansas and Florida, and doing this research that I would have never, ever, pursued. So they were able to, they understood what I was trying to do, and I understood. Fortunately, they had a much crankier person to write about than I did. And so I was glad I wasn't writing that biography. But his letters, he was a troubled man, let's just say that. But his letters yielded other information that was just really, really helpful. And I'll share two other last little stories, but very early in the process, in one of Ed's letters to Helen, I discovered that there was a little girl, another daughter, and he talked about her, and I just became really determined to give this little girl a life, that she didn't exist in our family genealogy, and her name was Corda, Corda. And I just thought that was the most tragic thing that, people lost children all the time back in the up until the mid-1900s, you could die of, a small infection. In fact, my mother had a brother who died of an infection. It was before the invention of penicillin. So, life was just really, really difficult. But Ed talked about this little girl, and I thought, oh my gosh, I just, have to find who she was, when she died. And so through this, I was able to do that because he writes about her in letters to Helen, and one thing led to another. And so she is part of the story, and that just felt really wonderful to me. And then the last thing I did, as I was working with UMass Press, the copy editor, we've all been in lockdown. This was this spring, and we'd all been in lockdown for a year, basically. And at another time, I would have been able to go to the Perkins School and meet deaf-blind children and, talk with somebody who's deaf-blind about what their life was like. But that couldn't happen at this stage. And so I decided I would read an autobiography called Haben by Haben Girma, who is the first deaf-blind graduate of Harvard Law School. And I got her autobiography on an audiobook, and I would walk and listen, and she reads it in her own voice. And I thought, oh gosh, she sounds so nice. I'm just gonna email her and ask her if she'll read my manuscript. And so I did one Sunday night, or Saturday afternoon, and Sunday night I got a message back from her, and she said, I would love to read it. She said, I hope I'll still like Helen Keller as much as I did. She said, she's my heroine growing up, and, I hope this doesn't ruin her for me. And I said, oh, I think you're still going to like her. So, yeah. And I said, the only thing I ask is that you tell me where you are in the book, because there's so many episodes and chapters in this story, and I just like to know, okay, you're there. I know what you're going to read next. So every night for a week, she would tell me what her reaction was to how far she'd read, and that was just really, really priceless. And in the end, she sent me a long list of things she, how she connected with the story, things that made her very angry as a disability rights advocate. Also things that she wished I would maybe say differently, which was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be sensitive to, the issues of people with deaf blindness. And so I benefited so much from that. And she put a 5-star review on Amazon this week, which just made my day. And she's a great person, and her autobiography is fascinating too. So I think of her as sort of a modern day Helen Keller. If you read mine and then you want to read what somebody today is experiencing as a deafblind person, I recommend it. I really do.
And didn't you say, unfortunately, so many of the issues are, people are still facing so many of the same issues that Helen faced.
Yeah, it's really, over 100 years later, they really still encounter, like Haben, Harvard sort of balked and wasn't sure how this was going to work. Was she going to be able to actually be successful in law school? And, just that able-bodied look at or view of things. So I learned so much from her, and I'm really, really appreciative. One of the things she said, just a perfect example, she said, the Perkins Institution, which is now called the Perkins School for the Blind, started out as the Perkins Institution for the Blind. And so early on, I referred to it a lot as the Perkins Institution. And Haben said, I just have to say that every time I read the word institution, I have a visceral reaction. And I thought, oh my gosh, of course you do. So I was able to just go back through and change as much as possible, just say Perkins or Perkins School. And so just little things like that we forget or don't think about. And so I really, really appreciated her input.
And I'll just say that before she takes questions, it was almost every week we get an email, or before the group met, Betsy would say, oh my gosh, what I have found now. I mean, it was just really fascinating. And you were able to really incorporate so much, and it's like, oh, another revision, here's another perspective. But the way it all opened up, and you said, how long is this going to keep? Am I going to just be
doing this forever?
Forever, finding out more, and then finally you were able to put an end to that. But anyway, that's enough. So
yeah, thank you.
Wonderful book. Wonderful book.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Do you have any questions you want to ask? Oh, yeah, okay. You first, Brian.
Well, fascinating, Betsy. Thank you. Betsy, a couple of things. Number one, how did she financially manage with Annie all the way through the...
Have to read the book.
Okay, that's number one. Number two, how would you be able to speak or write letters? Would she dictate all this to Annie? And like at a dinner party you were talking about, could she speak in ways that were her pronunciation, her language was fine? So both in writing and in spoken word.
Well, she had a Braille typewriter, and so the keys had Braille letters on them, and that's what she used from a very young age. I have a picture that I'll get in a minute that shows her typewriter. It just, I mean, it looks like a, typical typewriter, except I would say that it has more keys. And I mean, I think they just took more room to produce, she couldn't just look at the keys and type, she had to feel. So I think the key, whatever you want to call them, pads were a little bigger. So she typed, and if you wrote a letter to her, someone had to read it to her, because obviously most people can't produce a Braille letter. But the books she read were in Braille, and a lot of books were translated. There were funders who, one, paid for the cost of Braille books to be produced. There are still people who do that. There are philanthropies that will produce Braille books. They're much bigger, but people who are deafblind depend on those books. They love those books. And so when I communicated with Haben, I couldn't send her a PDF of the book. I had to send her a Word document, and she has an assistive device that translates the word into Braille for her to read. So, what else was I going to say?
And the spoken word.
Oh, spoken word. So Helen, she desperately wanted to speak, but she had lost language so early in her life that she had forgotten. Even though at 19 months she was beginning to speak, she was very precocious little girl. Her parents were extraordinarily proud of their healthy little girl, but she gradually forgot how to produce speech. And so I think the PBS documentary, if you watched it, it was difficult to understand her. She never really, she couldn't hear the sound that she was producing. And so therapists would work with her and, try to help her produce intelligible sound, but it was really difficult to understand her, much to her disappointment. I think Helen really, really wanted to be understood. Now, the Chamberlain family who lived with her were used to her speech, and so they could understand her probably better than most people. So, and I think they worked very hard to try to understand what she said.
So if you wanted to make a speech, Annie would translate and then project?
She did. They did at one point, talking about how they supported themselves. It was hard. They went on the vaudeville circuit, and she did try to speak at public events, but it was hard to understand her, versus Annie, who had a very eloquent speaking style. So Annie usually did do the speaking for the two of them. But I think people are always accusing Helen of being a fraud. And so I think that she really wanted to speak to sort of help debunk that, that I'm not a fraud. I'm Helen. No one else produced this writing for me. That was a frequent accusation that someone else wrote that for you. But no, she had her own voice, and the letters, that's I guess how I use her letters in the book. That's Helen's voice.
And you'll get the financial
you will.
angst.
You'll read about
that. It's really, what they went through is like, but they manage. But that's another really interesting line through the book. I found it's just like, oh my gosh, how do these two women, and then with all these forces working against them and donors who sort of fickle donors and stuff. It's really quite a story.
Yeah, and the Boston Transcript was a big advocate for her and for this Perkins School, raising money. I worked in development at the Hill Center, and sometimes when I read, about the Transcript's efforts on behalf of the Kindergarten for the Blind or the Perkins School, I thought, well, this is what I did for 13 years at the Hill Center, working with donors. Oh, is it? Do we have time? Oh, okay. Thanks. She's just sitting. Other questions? Amy, you had one.
I was wondering about how Helen was able to read your book, and so I was wondering about, is there an audiobook, and how might it be made available to you?
Yeah, so I worried about that too. I thought, here I am producing a book about people who with deaf blindness, and can they actually read this? So Haben can read it on a Kindle. So her device must translate to Braille. There are, I think that there's, I have to remember what they said. So UMass Press said it's, I think, on an audiobook, or it will be, but there's also something called like Bookshare that makes it accessible in different ways. So I'm not exactly sure, but that is a concern. And I just communicated with Haben this last week, because I said, I want to send you a signed copy of the book, and then I thought, but you can't read it. So how insensitive is that? But I said, how can I get a copy to you? And she said, if it's on Kindle, then I can read it. So yeah, just imagine how assistive technology is helping make things
So how does Kindle translate it into Braille writing?
I'm not sure. But she has a device. Haben has a device that is a reader.
It comes up to Braille to the touch.
Yes, to her. Yeah, but her keyboard then, is streaming for her in a way that she can read. She talks about meeting Obama at the White House and asking his staff if Obama could type, because in order to communicate, she needed him to type to her. And they laughed and said, yes, he can type. So it was really a cute part of her autobiography.
So Betsy, if they're sitting around the dinner table and Annie's next to her and the conversation's flowing here and there and Annie's spelling into her hand, how can you possibly spell words fast enough to keep up with the conversation?
I don't know. I wonder that too.
Do they have lots
But
of abbreviations between the two of them or something?
Yeah, I think they were just so proficient, and they may have had sort of a shorthand as well that, allowed them to speed things up. The other thing is that Haben told me that, Helen and Ed communicated by touching. They're using, it's a method called the Tadoma method. And so I talked a lot about that, they placed their fingers a certain way and then on the larynx, and that way they could communicate. And I had mentioned that, and Haben told me, she said, I don't know anyone who's deafblind who uses that method. And she said, and I really don't want to propagate the idea that deafblind people want their faces touched. So
That's a change.
That is a change, I think, or a personal preference. I don't know, but she said, I find it really offensive when people want to touch my face. So, I don't know everything, but those are my assumptions that I'm making, that I know that Helen and Ed communicated that way, and she only did that with people she knew very well.
Talking about touch, was there ever any romance in it?
Oh yeah, people. There's been. Helen apparently had a relationship with someone one summer when Annie was away, and that is talked about occasionally. And there's a novel called Helen, Keller in Love, and Haben finds that book extremely offensive. So, I'm deferring to her reaction to it. And I really, honestly, I read it and I really felt like it was rather salacious. Haben is a disability rights attorney and activist, and there are a couple episodes in the book that she says, especially women with disabilities encounter sort of predatorial, men in their lives. And she said, I can't tell you how many deafblind, or not only deafblind women, but women with disabilities experience these things. So I'm sort of going to just leave that.
What has become of Red Farm now?
Well, Red Farm is still there. It is actually going to be for sale very soon. But I benefited from the wonderful connection with the current owners who've owned the farm, owned Red Farm, not the farm. It's no longer a farm. It's just the house. Since 1972, it's been in the same family. And so this family, these adults, they're approximately my age, grew up in that house. I met their mother, who at the time I met her was probably 88, very politically active woman, just really, really nice. And her kids are all in touch with me and had not read the manuscript, but they knew the book was in the works, and they sent me photos. They've been just really, really, interested in it. And they're reading it, and I'm getting a good response. I said, I don't know if you always want to know what happened in the house you lived and grew up in. And there was some tragedy, so, but they're a wonderful family, so I think they're going to enjoy it. Wrentham, Massachusetts is pretty much famous for Helen Keller. She went back to Wrentham. She bought her own house there, and there's Helen Keller Elementary School in Wrentham, and a lot of people know that she was there. They don't know why she was there, and they don't know the Chamberlain story. So the Murray family who lives in the house, they're just convinced that there's going to be such a huge audience. And it is going to be a revelation for a lot of people in Wrentham, Massachusetts, there's no doubt. But the house is still there. It does not look the same. It was the house that part of it was built in the 1600s, and then it was added onto and remodeled, and the farm built up around it. All of the farm is gone. All of the farm buildings, the barns, that's all gone now. And they've sort of stripped the house back to just being a colonial style house. They took off dormers and porches, and and that I think was done in the 70s. So, but it is still red. It is still a red house. So, anyways, I guess we have to. Oh, Jim, go ahead. Really quick.
Well, I have a quick comment and a question. You mentioned that you were really conscious of the fact that you didn't want to diminish the writing of these two incredible people. But I think one of the things that makes this book special is that the narrative that you provided is a third voice. Mm-hmm. And it's a voice that is attached in intimate ways to both of those people, one in particular, but both of those people. So I think that's what makes it a really interesting read, is that it's got this contemporary view and it has a historical view as well.
Thank you.
And then the question I have is, you mentioned political activism, and there's so many interesting topics that go on, that must have gone and did go on between them in their letters: suffrage and the world wars and the Depression and all that. Do you have one that was particularly a political topic that was particularly intriguing to you as you looked at the letters?
I think that Helen and Ed really, really connected over children living in poverty, and also just like people who are victimized. And so you'll see that in the book that she had a lot of interests and issues that she stood for or advocated for. But I really think it really started with Ed Chamberlain and his just feelings for the downtrodden.
This was the time of tenement housing.
Yeah, there's a bit in there about an article he had written called "The Victim," and that you can tell just really resonated with Helen, and they talk about it. I mention it, and then it comes up again years later. So it really, really resonated with her and mattered a lot. But that's a great question. Thank you. Well, we could talk all night. Thank